On September 1st, 1873, Lottie Moon went across the ocean on her way to North China. She'd known for a long time that this is where she was supposed to be. At the age of 34, she finally answered the call and went. It was a decision that was not only going to impact the lives of those Chinese people that she ministered to, but to Southern Baptists for now 150 years later. So what was it about Lottie Moon as to why she is still a household name in churches? Well, I found three things that to me just really stood out. The first thing is that she became all things to all people. When she arrived in China, she was considered a linguist, and she was already fluent in English and French, Latin and Greek. And yet, when she began learning the Chinese language, it was so challenging that she had a language teacher for her entire 40 years that she was in China. And the reason is because at one point, the Foreign Mission Board was like, why are you still learning Chinese? Have you not learned it yet? And she's like, but it's always changing, and she always needed to be able to speak to the people. And so she took it very seriously. When she first arrived there, she was in a coastal city where there was a team of missionaries, and they had a house where the missionaries lived, and it was decorated, Western style, like the missionaries wanted it. But she slowly transformed it to a Chinese home, and she began dressing like the Chinese, and she began eating like the Chinese. And the reason was because she explained that in a land like China, where the people were very afraid of foreigners, and she said, you come into this strange land, and, the people, they were calling her Devil Woman because they were scared. They told their children stories of how, the foreigners would come in and steal little children if they were bad at night. And, obviously that didn't endear her to the people there. But slowly she adopted their ways, and she became like them. And she stressed how important that was, because she said, first you've got to convince them that you're human. And then you've got to convince them that you're a friend. And only then can you get your message across. But there was one thing that she did that was Western, and that was cookies. She had her favorite cookies from when she was growing up in Virginia, and she always had a batch of cookies waiting, and that's how she would draw the women and the children in. But she didn't just stay in her house and wait for them to come to her. She went to them. Now, when she first arrived, she was in, like I said, a coastal town. They weren't quite as afraid of foreigners because being on the coast, they had been introduced to, people from all other lands and everything, but still they were not particularly receptive to the gospel. They didn't hate the foreigners, but they didn't love them either. And so there were all these villages around. And so one by one, she would try to go to the neighboring villages and reach those people. She would have a contact with this person. She would go to their home and just start talking to them, have them invite their neighbors over, and one-on-one, that's how she would minister. She recorded that in one 6-month period, she made 153 visits in the city and the villages, which if you get to thinking 6 months, 153 visits, and made even more so when you factor that each of these villages was, 5, 10, 15 miles away. She traveled by walking sometimes, a mule sometimes, and a sedan chair, which if y'all don't know what that is, a sedan chair, which I think would be really cool to ride in, but it's basically a box. It's got a seat in it. You get in it. It has 2 poles, and men carry you on their shoulder. And she said it was never very comfortable, but that was okay. She didn't complain. And that's how she would travel from village to village. Her thing was, wherever there is a home and there's a woman in it, then that's where, that's our mission field, and that's where I need to be. Of course, it wasn't easy. In her letters that she wrote back home, or in her letters to the Foreign Mission Board where she was pleading for them to send more missionaries, she wanted them to know this is not a glamorous life. And she would detail the loneliness, the betrayal, the disappointment, the self-denial, the sacrifices that she would make. And it wasn't that she was trying to get, people to feel sorry for her. She just wanted people to know this is the life that you're going for. And especially as a single woman, because she didn't have a husband there to support her. It was just her. Now, I used to wonder years ago when I would learn about Lottie Moon, I always wondered, why wasn't she married? And I discovered that she did have a beau. They met in college, and they kind of were pretty serious, but then she decided that she needed to concentrate on God and her ministry, and so they went their separate ways. But then once she was in China, he became a professor in Europe, and they started corresponding, and at one point they were going to get married. She was going to come back home. I don't know where they were going to live, but they were going to get married. And in the meantime, while he was in Europe, he had been introduced to evolution. And he decided that you could have evolution and the Bible, and it all worked just fine. And Lottie Moon said, no, it doesn't. And that was a deal breaker for her. So she broke up with him, and the best I can determine, that was the end of her romantic life. So in case y'all have ever wondered about that, now you know. But the thing is she wasn't just a single woman. She made the most of it. And that's one thing I really like, is that she discovered that a single woman could go where men could not go. Her thing was always, what about the women? What about the women? And they said she was constantly, when she would contact the Foreign Mission Board, when she would contact anybody, it was, what about the women? Because she thought it was very important to reach the women. And so whether it was in the city, whether it was in the villages, wherever she was at, she was always focused on the women. This is the late 1800s, when women were not on a high priority, and women were just supposed to be seen and not heard. You didn't get much education, you got married, you had children, and that was your life. And so one of the fellow missionaries said that she was a woman ahead of her time, a generation ahead of her time, she said, and that she was a pioneer. But she was actually just following along in the way that she was raised. Now, her mother seems like a very interesting person. Her mother, they came from a very wealthy family, a society family, and her mother felt that education was very important, as was spiritual upbringing. When they moved to Virginia, there was no church in their area. They would have circuit preachers that would come periodically, but they didn't have a regular Sunday school, regular services, and her mother felt that this was very important that they have it. So for 10 years, she had church in their house, and everybody came. Now, why on earth Mr. Moon didn't do the services, I don't know, but for 10 years, she was the one leading this church. When they finally got a pastor, then she went on her way, because she wasn't a women's libber. She just thought it was very important that they had a spiritual upbringing. She also thought it was important that her girls have an education. Now, everybody else thought this was really strange, because they were society. They didn't need an education. If you wanted an education, you went to finishing school, and you learned to play the piano and draw and learn French so that you can, do your highfalutin French talk. But other than that, there was really no reason for an education. But her mother felt like her daughter should have every available opportunity. So her oldest sister ended up becoming a doctor. She graduated from medical school, was one of the first women in her class. She went on to Europe and went to medical schools there as well, and became a missionary, medical missionary in Jerusalem. And then Lottie Moon's youngest sister, who was considerably younger than the other two girls, at 18, she decided that she was going to be a missionary to China. And so she's actually the one that led the way. Now, when I think about Lottie Moon going at 34 as a single woman going to China, that's big enough, but an 18-year-old going on her own to China? Unfortunately, she had health problems, so they were only together in China for a year before she had to go back home. But Lottie was just doing what, she had been raised. Lottie went to college, and she was a teacher, and then she ran schools. And when she got to China, she just did what she had always done. She taught. the girls, she taught the women, she ran schools, and the way it was set up, there was, I believe when she first got there were 6 missionaries. There were 2 men and 4 women, and they each had their jobs, and they had like a council where they, would get together and make their decisions and decide what they were going to do. And it worked for them. It was very efficient. Well, Lottie Moon wrote about what they did in the Foreign Mission Journal, and she was detailing, her role in all this. And some good Southern Baptist men read it and said, this will not work whatsoever. We're not going to have women making decisions in a church. And so they had the convention, and they passed a bill that said women missionaries were not going to have any say in what was done. Well, word got across the ocean to Lottie Moon, and she wrote back a letter and said, if I don't have any say in what I do, if I have to keep silent, then I'm no longer going to be a missionary. Please send me enough money so that I can get back home, and I will officially turn in my resignation. This was in 1885. Well, needless to say, that didn't work. They, quickly made amends and said, we're sorry, we're not trying to change the way you're doing things. And they didn't want to lose her, and so they worked it out. Now, as a single woman, she discovered, too, that there were things that she could do that the men couldn't do. And now one of those is she learned about a town called Pingtu. Now, the coastal areas were considered much safer than the interior cities because the farther inland you went, the less receptive they were to foreigners, and the more dangerous it was considered. Pingtu was 115 miles inland, and it was, very much just an isolated community. However, word was that years ago, a missionary had come there and had spoken to them and said that the people were receptive to the gospel. And so Lottie Moon started thinking, okay, it's not safe for the men to go because if the foreign men went, then they would be attacked or, But she said, I bet they wouldn't be threatened by a single woman. So she decided she was going. And the men said, I don't think so. They said, it's not safe for you. You're not going to have a man to protect you. And she said, you know what? I'm not putting my trust in men. She said, I'm putting my trust in God. And if I'm going with God, then he'll take care of it. And so she made plans to go to Pingtu to reach this interior city. It was so dangerous that they had to pass through, towns where foreigners would not be welcome. So they had to travel by night. She was in her little sedan chair. They had to muffle the mules that were going along with them. They had to, hide her in there just to get her to this city. But once she got there, she discovered that the people were begging for the gospel. And whereas in the coastal city, they had been pretty much like, who cares? They didn't hate the missionaries, but they weren't real excited about them either. In Pingtu, they were begging to hear what she had to say. And so she would just teach all these women, and more women would come to hear what she had to say. And then there were all the surrounding villages, and she would go to those villages. And it was a very exciting time in her ministry, but it was also a very exhausting time because, again, she was the only missionary. She was the only foreigner in this entire town all by herself ministering. And so she was getting ready for a furlough. And she headed back to her town. She was getting ready to come over to the U.S., and 2 men showed up at her door. They had walked the 115 miles from Pingtu, and they had heard the women talking about, the gospel, and they begged her. They said, could you please come and share some more? We've got to hear more. We just need to hear. And so she didn't go on her furlough. She went back to Pingtu, and she continued talking to the women, but then something happened. Men started coming. And she didn't know what to do because she can't teach men, she's a woman, but these men were begging for the gospel. And so she was so concerned, and finally she came up with a solution. She said, okay, She gave the men Bibles. She gave the men books. She said, y'all sit here back behind me. And then she taught the women. And if the men just happened to hear what she taught, well, she figured even Paul couldn't find fault with that. So that's what she did. But it really disturbed her that there were not men there to do the job. And so she was always begging and pleading with the Foreign Mission Board, we need men, we need men. But if they weren't there, then she was going to do it herself. And I had a really cool quote, which I don't see right away, but I'm going to give it the Sharon version of her quote. Basically, she was complaining, and she was saying, it's a really peculiar thing that I wonder how heaven looks at this. How can we have, revival when we don't have anybody to do the communion and we don't have anybody to baptize and we have to use a Presbyterian minister to have our pulpit? And she said, we have 500 preachers in Virginia and we have no one that'll come here. She said, I wonder how it looks in heaven because it looks pretty peculiar here in China. And so I thought that was a lot of fun. And another time, they had, anytime there was like war or disturbance or anything going on, they would put him at the coastal city. Well, in 1911, they had the revolution. And so it was deemed unsafe for everybody to be in interior city, so they all came. And there, in one of the slightly interior cities, was a hospital. And they had several men that were running the hospital, a doctor and, the staff and everything. Well, they had to come back to the coastal city. Well, it's a revolution. There's a lot of injured, wounded people. And so Lottie Moon just sat there worrying about it. What's going to happen? So she snuck away and she went to that hospital. And, she had been during the Civil War. She knew how to bandage and do all that. And so she taught the women what to do. And when the men finally came back to the hospital, those women had it all under control. So, it's just kind of fun that Lottie Moon knew what she was doing. But even, I forgot something. And this is a really cool part. When they came back, like her mother, she said, okay, the men are here. I can go back, to safety. But then they said, no, you can't. Because fighting is going on the route between here and the city, and it wouldn't be safe for you, because they're fighting both sides. So it doesn't bother me. She sent words to the leaders of both of the armies, and she said, I need to get back to the city. Could you stop fighting? And they did. And so while this elderly woman walked from this city to this, fighting stopped for a day. And, they knew her by this point. I was thinking, how cool that at first she was the devil woman. And now they loved this woman so much that both sides just stopped. Now that's pretty cool. But again, even if she had been really brave, we probably still wouldn't be talking about her. So she did one other thing. She felt that it was very important for women to get organized. She was always trying to get the women involved, and she said it's not like we want to do stuff to aggravate the brethren. We just need to get our act together so that we can better support missions. And she said if we could just join together, and if we could study and we could pray and we could give, then it would make a difference. She said, otherwise, if we don't, then it's going to be like the way it is now. And it's just, hand to foot. We're just constantly we're burning out our missionaries. And we have these whole stations that are not being served. She's like, we've got to get our act together. And so she wrote articles. And at one point, she said, what would be a really cool idea is if at Christmas time, when everybody is feeling generous, what if we joined together the week before Christmas and we started praying for missions and we started giving? And, it was just kind of a suggestion in an article. And 3 months later, they had the convention, and the women joined together in 1888, and they formed the Women's Missionary Union. And the secretary of that newly formed organization was Miss Annie Armstrong. And she got to thinking about what Lottie had said. And she said, what if we did that? What if we organized and we had a Christmas offering to help these missionaries? Because Lottie Moon was always begging, send us more missionaries, we need this. And so she said, could we do this? And I thought it was really funny because their biggest concern was we'd need some pamphlets and things to hand out, and it would cost $100 for literature to get the word out. Should we spend that $100? Well, they did, and they raised enough that first year to send 2 missionaries to China and still had a little bit to spare. And so that brings me to why we're here. The Lottie Moon offering used to be a big deal. I remember being in churches and, every Christmas, either myself or somebody else, we would dress up like Lottie Moon and we would talk about Lottie Moon. And I remember having contests where we would have these charts and, you had to each week see how far and if you reached your goal, and it was a really big deal. And people got excited, but over time, Lottie Moon has kind of gone out of style. And people don't really care as much. And it's easy to think that it doesn't matter, but it does. In 1893, Lottie Moon spoke at it was a convention meeting, but she was just speaking to the women and sharing with them some of the needs that they had, one of which was they needed a medical missionary. She kept saying, we need a doctor to come. Well, even though she was just talking to the women, there was a pastor who was in the back, and something about what she said stuck with him. And he began praying for Lottie Moon and for that missionary that they needed. 3 years later, he was preaching a sermon, and he happened to mention in passing about Lottie Moon and about how she had mentioned the need for a doctor to be a missionary. In his congregation was a Presbyterian doctor who heard that sermon, and it got his mind rolling. And 10 years from the time that she first spoke to those women and said, we need a doctor, that Presbyterian doctor, who was now Baptist and married, came over to China, and he not only became the missionary that was needed, but he actually became her personal doctor. So I thought that was like a really cool story. And then another time, they had various schools, for girls, for boys and all this, but there was a need. They were always having to rent buildings, and they didn't necessarily have access to it all the time. And so one of their biggest needs throughout the years was they wanted to have a building which they could purchase and that it would be accessible all the time. Well, she kept begging the Foreign Mission Board, saying, please, we need this, and they kept saying, we can't help, we're in debt. I don't know how many times in her letter she asked for stuff, and the Foreign Mission Board said, we're in debt, we can't help. But anyway, they couldn't help, and there was a Sunbeam group, and for those of you who don't know, the Sunbeams were the children, like what would now be like the Mission Friends or the GAs and RAs. Well, they took it upon themselves to raise money, and that little group of children from one church raised $453, and that was enough to purchase the building which they wanted for a school. And so I thought that was so cool that the Foreign Mission Board couldn't afford it, but a little group of children managed to get the money. But now there's one last story. In 1911, severe famine hit North China. The missionaries watched helplessly as literally thousands of people were dying. And the missionaries were helpless. And they were begging the Foreign Mission Board. They were saying there is such a need. People are just dying from hunger. We need money to help. And the Foreign Mission Board again said, we're in debt. We can't do anything, sorry. So the missionaries, who obviously did not have large salaries, they did not have much money, they gave of their salary, they were giving everything they had, they were doing everything, and it wasn't even making a dent. And Pingtu, her beloved city, was one of the ones that was worst hit, and they just kept getting word of all these people that were dying, and the hunger just got, the starvation, hunger, everything was just getting worse and worse. And she just couldn't bear to eat when those around her had no food. And without anybody realizing what was happening, Lottie Moon starved herself. When they finally figured out what was going on, she weighed 50 pounds. They said, they tried to send her to Japan to recover. She died on the way. On her grave, they wrote, 40 years a missionary of Southern Baptist Convention to China, faithful until death. Now, according to the latest statistics, there are currently 4.3 billion lost people. 1.7 billion of those lost people have never even heard the name of Jesus. They don't know there's such a thing as Christianity. Working to reach those 4.3 billion lost people are 3,612 Southern Baptist career missionaries and others ready to go when resources become available. Southern Baptist failed Lottie Moon. Lottie Moon begged for the money, and the people didn't give. And so I challenge us. We can be like the Foreign Mission Board who said we don't have it, or we can be like those sunbeams who give.